Well, hello everybody, my name's Louise Savage. Very warm welcome to my channel, Louise Savage Muses. Welcome back if you're a returning viewer, and hello if you're a new viewer to my musings / ramblings / whatever they're supposed to be. So I have completely loved this journey of reading the long list for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, its inaugural year. I was very excited when I set out on this journey, but a little bit daunted. The journey isn't quite over, as I'll explain, but I do want to report back on the remaining 6 books because the shortlist is going to be announced on Wednesday, and I thought you might want to know my views beforehand. So without further ado, I will dive into these wonderful 6 books in front of me. So the first one is How to Say Babylon by Safiya Sinclair. I thought this was a fantastic read. I can't disguise that fact. It's stunning in the sense that I knew nothing, I realise now, about Rastafarianism. So it's a memoir. Safiya Sinclair grew up in a Rastafari household. She writes about her life from before her birth. She gives us information about her parents, a little bit of information about her grandparents, and then charts her own childhood in a lot of detail, growing up with a father who was very committed to Rastafarianism. And the book opens with the arrival of Haile Selassie in Jamaica, who the Rastafari had appointed as their god. And I found that whole background about where Rastafarianism came from really, really fascinating. I won't go into detail because I think you should go away and read this if you're interested. But I hadn't realised it was such a new religion. It only emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. I hadn't realised the premise behind it, and I certainly hadn't quite realised, or I think it was there in my sort of on the periphery of my consciousness, but how repressive it could be, particularly for female children in a household. So she charts her upbringing, and her mother has embraced the religion as well. She marries into it willingly, but gradually begins to realise, or maybe realises quite early on, the imposition that it's placing on her children and the way it could potentially perhaps hold them back. And so her mother works really, really hard to ensure that all her children are educated to the best standard that they can possibly manage in this very sort of poor, economically threatened household. And at a young age, Safiya becomes very interested in poetry. She becomes a poet. And her achievements and the achievements of others of her siblings are absolutely phenomenal when you consider in many ways she was kept a prisoner in her own home, not just in her teens, but beyond that into her early 20s. She was still confined in the paternal household, partly because of her duty and her commitment to her siblings and to her mother. So I found this book astonishing. It's the poetry, the language in it is absolutely beautiful. You can see that she's a poet, and the narrative is really compelling as well. So even though she goes into great depth and detail about the existence of the family, and you almost feel like she's telling her story in real time. It's really clever. I couldn't put it down. I read it very quickly. I kind of, devoured it, and yet I didn't really kind of want it to finish. And by the end of it, I felt that I really knew and understood her. Now, of course, I've never met her, but it's one of those books that just resonates in so many different ways. So it gave me an education, it entertained me, it fascinated me, and it also opened up huge amount of empathy for Safiya herself. So yeah, fantastic. I can see why it was chosen for the long list. Now next up is Alice Albinia's The Britannias, which I was really looking forward to reading because I read one of her novels some time ago and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know that she's got a really deep intellect. Now, I've struggled with this book, and I don't think it's her, I think it's me. She's looking, it's a really interesting idea. She's looking at the islands that surround the British Isles. That's why it's called the Britannias. And a lot of these islands, well, all of these islands have deep roots in very early history of this area. So she's looking at the early colonisation of those places, the early influences on those places, and also discovering stories of women that relate to them as well. So, for example, she starts off in Orkney, she looks at Mesolithic burial chambers, thinks about, you know, the connection or the similarity between the shapes and the shape of a woman's womb, etc. And all of these things I've found interesting, but as I'm reading it, for some reason, and I think it's me, the information isn't sticking. I think partly because she's dotting around from place to place, and she looks at each place in depth, but for each place that she covers, so for example, from Orkney to Lindisfarne to, I don't know, the Shetlands, I felt I was not bombarded, but there were an awful lot of dates and lots of facts and material that I kind of was trying to get my head around as she was telling me the narrative. And maybe it's a bit narrative light, and that's perhaps why I've struggled to read it. I downloaded it as well on Audible because I thought maybe if I listen to it, it'll stick with me better. But I'm still finding it quite ethereal and sort of struggling to find a common thread through it, even though she's interwoven it with very small moments where she refers to her own personal experience during the course of doing the research for the book. She's got two very young children, one of them's a baby at the beginning, and it's clear that her marriage is struggling, and she's sort of setting, you know, she's thinking about her own relationships and her own life against the backdrop of all these women who've gone before, which I think is a, you know, really interesting thing to do. And the other thing that really impresses me about this book is that it's deeply spiritual. You know, there's a real sort of resonance of spirituality, and I think she writes about that beautifully. So I don't know whether I've just picked it up at the wrong time, it's just not the right time for me. I'm really not sure, or whether it's because, so for example, you know, quite early on she focuses on Anglesey and the Druids and the Romans. That was something that I knew quite a bit about already. I don't know whether that's why I've sort of found it hard to concentrate on it as I was reading it, and as a result I still haven't quite finished it. I'm listening to it now rather than reading it, and I haven't got to the end. So don't let that put you off, because I think, you know, it's a really, there are lots of beautiful things about this book, but for some reason I've found it quite difficult to stick with. And next up is Young Queens. Now, this book by Leah, Redmond, Chang, how do I describe it? I was fully expecting to get a bit bogged down in this book, and I really didn't want to, because when I was a child I read Young Elizabeth and Young Mary by Jean Plaidy, who was she wrote historical fiction, but also those two books were really essentially non-fiction because they were so well researched. Fictionalized non-fiction, if there is such a thing. And I loved those books. I read them more than once. So when I knew that Young Queens, it's a history book, it tells the lives of three women from that era. So there's Catherine de Medici, there's Mary Queen of Scots, and there's Elizabeth de Valois. And what I love about this book is that it's bringing back the absolute thrill that I had as a child and a young woman in reading about Tudor women from that era, so Renaissance women, because actually they span beyond the Tudor period now and predate it possibly. I'm trying to think whether Catherine Medici does, certainly her family roots do. So she starts with Catherine de Medici because she's the older generation, as it were, and writes about her growing up in Italy. Her family is not, the Medicis themselves are entrepreneurs, really, merchants. They're not royalty, but she herself is descended from French royalty. So she ends up being married off to the King of France. So there's all that idea of her being a very interesting young woman, but really her only value is as a political pawn in these dynastic marriages. And she is the sort of the older generation, and then Mary and Elizabeth both. Elizabeth is Catherine's daughter, and Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, is when she's 5, is sent from Scotland to the French court to be educated there, because the hope is that she will marry into which she indeed does, into the French royal family, and gain power for herself and for Scotland, form strong alliances that way. So you have these 3 women. Elizabeth de Valois is married off to Philip II of Spain, who, and I didn't know very much about, if anything, about her at all. In fact, I don't think I knew, or I'd forgotten that he'd married after Mary Tudor, his second wife, had died. So I'm just absolutely just bowled away by this book, because she's obviously researched her subject incredibly thoroughly, but she narrates these women's stories. The way that she manages to interweave them and to very, very gradually but compellingly build a sense of who they were, their different personalities. So the 3 women are very distinct in my mind, partly through, you know, their personal letters to them, all sorts of historical documents that still survive, particularly around, well, all of them actually, to be fair. I was going to say Mary, Queen of Scots, but that's not true. All 3 of them. And she also takes you to all these different places. So I feel like I've been to the French court. I feel like I've watched them, particularly the men, plotting, and the way that these women have to arm themselves intellectually, physically, you know, the descriptions of their early experiences, or her assumption what their earliest experiences of sex and marriage are really fascinating. And the way that they are, you know, particularly Elizabeth de Valois, she's expected to negotiate on the behalf of the French as a 14-year-old girl. In fact, I think she might be 13 when she's first married off to Philip and travels to Spain. Can you imagine? You know, making that huge. It's a really long way from home. She'll never see her family again, and she's sent off to not only to a completely different country where she barely speaks the language, but she's also expected, as her role, and she would have seen it very much as her duty, and took it clearly very seriously, to, you know, to sort of spy on her husband, to be aware of the political machinations in the court, etc., etc. And you realise what a tightrope these women were walking, and also how incredibly skilled they were in managing to survive as long as they did in those circumstances. So it's intriguing, it's, you know, the spying, there's all sorts of plot twists, except they're not, because it's their real lives. I thought this was sensational, and she, you know, I just love her. I love Leah Redmond Chang's writing style as well. It's all really crystal clear and beautifully told. Great stuff. And next to Code Dependent. Now, I can't lie, I don't think I was particularly looking forward to picking this up. Sorry to Madhumita Murgia for that confession, but I think, you know, AI spooks me. I know that I should take an interest. I know that I should know much more about it, but I was quite reluctant. You know, maybe I would read a news article, but I was quite reluctant to sit down and read an entire book about it. How wrong was I? Because of course I is encroaching on all of our lives, and particularly in terms of our personal data. And Madhumita starts off by looking at, you know, she's asking questions about the amount of data about herself. If she looked at herself from the perspective of artificial intelligence, what would it work out about her? What sort of character would it present her as to any organisation? But then she takes you on a journey to all sorts of different places, and some of them, so very often it's, you know, I had no idea that in Africa there are groups of people who are effectively working in AI sweatshops where they're interpreting information for very, very little money in very awful conditions in order to help big companies to create even more efficient artificial intelligence. I was particularly interested in, there are several chapters in here that really fascinated me. So there's one where she talks about AI in medicine, which I thought was really interesting. And she looks at a female doctor who's working on tuberculosis patients and the way that AI could be used to aid with that diagnosis as kind of an assistant to the doctor's interpretation. So there are points at which, not many, points at which she starts to look at AI as being a force for good. But she also looks at the racial bias of AI, and she looks at, for example, the idea that Black people experience pain in a different way. And this has been something that's been anecdotally around for a very, very long time. But through a doctor's analysis of patients suffering from arthritis and looking at their knees and getting AI to look at their knees, it's becoming clear that there is some physiological reason for this. It's not a psychological thing. It's actually a physiological reason why Black people might well experience pain in a very different way to white people. So those things are exciting, but also she points out the frustrations that run alongside that as well. And she writes about the use of AI as a police tool, which I hadn't known about. She goes into great detail about a policing program that was implemented in Amsterdam and how deeply flawed potentially it is, because it's by asking questions that you create the data. And if those questions or the areas of interest that you're looking at are in themselves biased, then you create a problem. So she focuses on a woman called Diane whose two sons are targeted as being very liable to commit serious crimes as they get older. And they're targeted via AI because the older son does actually threaten a young man with a knife when he's about 12. And therefore he's arrested and gets a criminal record. And based on that, he and his brother who has done nothing, are targeted by social services. The police regularly come around and check on them, and their lives are completely transformed, and she would argue vandalized, that's my word, not hers, because they're on this list and they're being watched, and there are certain things they will never be able to do as a result of that. So it's looking at the way that AI can be used for what might appear to be positive uses for the state. I mean, if you can prevent young people from committing crimes, then you're saving the state a lot of money and you're saving those children's lives potentially, but how it can very, very easily be misused. And the most alarming thing about it, of course, is that both these boys are Black, and that the racial bias towards young Black men is borne out by the AI as it's constructed as well, because they're looking at one of the things they take into account when they create the database is they take into account where someone lives, where the young men live. Well, of course, you know, Black people may tend to live in a particular area of a city. They take into account the number of times, for example, that the parent has phoned social services, contact social services. It might be that that parent has contacted social services as a plea for help, not necessarily for other reasons. So she makes a really strong case for us to be extremely cautious about the use of our personal data, and how companies and political institutions are increasingly using data to try to change society for the better, but actually potentially could be really damaging if it's not properly moderated. So yeah, I found this very interesting. This reminded me, quite often I was reminded of Some People Need Killing, which I read earlier on in my long list journey, because she uses a lot of case material and witness testimony as she builds her arguments about AI. So I found that really fascinating. And then Vulture Capitalism. Wow. I, again, was quite nervous about picking this book up. I really like my politics. I'm very interested in politics, but I haven't really done any. I mean, I read the papers and I listen to the news, but I don't tend to pick up books that are, you know, that are political books. Well, I've realised that actually that's a mistake, because I've thoroughly enjoyed this book. So Grace Blakeley is looking at the whole concept of capitalism, particularly how she feels it's really misunderstood. She very, very carefully creates this fantastic argument. So she starts off by looking at big corporations and the way that they operate, and particularly the way that they can be extremely dishonest, and that what motivates them is making money at the expense of the workers. And she uses Boeing, the Dreamliner story, as a case study, and she looks at the story of Henry Ford, who I knew very little about, actually. Again, I've realised just how ignorant I am. I didn't know about Fordlandia, which was this town that he set up. Well, when I say town, he bought acres and acres and acres of Brazilian land and created this dream city there. But just down the road, there were lots of Brazilian workers who were being exploited. This was because he wanted rubber. And the whole thing was a complete disaster, because the Americans didn't educate themselves about how to plant rubber. They relied on the indigenous population. And of course, it all went very wrong. The rubber plants died, got various disease, and I don't think he made a single penny out of it. So I found those narratives really, really compelling. And there's something about the way she writes that it's almost like you're listening to a speech. She writes in a very rhetorical, no, that's not quite fair, but it is, there isn't a single word that is lost in this book. She builds a very compelling case. She's having looked at big corporate firms, she then looks at the relationship between them and the banks, which I found absolutely fascinating, and the relationship between the bank and the state. And then she starts to look at the way that economists have viewed those institutions over the years, and starts to suggest alternative ways that we might run ourselves that would benefit everybody, rather than simply benefiting this very, very small percentage of the population. And she really demonstrates in this book how the greed of a very, very small number of people permeates and corrupts the whole of society. And I'm not making it sound perhaps as interesting as I should, because I found this absolutely fascinating. Again, I gobbled it up. I was not expecting it to. She also looks at the green agenda as well. So she explores the economics behind that, looks at the oil industries and so on. And some of the things that she's, you know, the information that I am now availed of because I've read this book is really shocking. So for example, during COVID, the American government, they had something called PPE, not the PPE that we would think of in the UK, the protective masks and so on, not that scandal, but this was government funded bailouts for business. And she describes business after business after business, you know, businesses that were making millions and millions of pounds, names that you would be familiar with, who were receiving these huge government grants but at the end of the year giving their shareholders massive bonuses. You know, so there was one company, I can't remember who it was now, who I think gave their shareholders $140 billion between them, and then the following day received a bailout from the government. And so her argument is that you know, the government is directing its money at the wrong people. It should be directing its money at the workers, not at the powerful who are basically paying these minimal wages, and that we could be running our economies in a very, very different way. She also looks at how interrelated economies are across the world. So there's a whole world in this book that a lot of it I knew about or was on my peripheral consciousness, but I feel like I've had a real education reading this. And finally, Shadows at Noon by Joya Chatterji. Now, I have a massive confession to make here, and I've just realised that I've forgotten, and I know I did it in my last video as well, I might have to backtrack a minute, but I've forgotten to use the criteria as I've been looking at each of these books like I did in the previous videos, except I realised I didn't do that for Eve by Kat Bohannon, and I don't think I did it for the Dictionary People either. But I'd just like to say that I think both books passed all the criteria in my view. Now, this book, Shadows at Noon, I've picked it up so many times and I've read probably about 100 pages, which isn't a lot because it's a big chunky thing. And my intention was to dip into it and read bits as I read the other books because it's such a massive tome. And the bits that I've read, I've thoroughly enjoyed. I think it's she's really masterful in describing very complex historical details. So the beginning, the section that I've read is all about the birth of India, because she's decided to focus on only 100 years of Indian history. So she's, you know, she's talking about it's called the South Asian 20th century, but she defines South Asia very, very clearly at the beginning as being India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, and builds this picture to set the scene for what's going to follow. And she does it so carefully and so beautifully, and I am really enjoying reading it. But I question the accessibility of this, and that's partly, and it's because accessibility is one of the criteria here. So it's very clear that she has done really, I've got that upside down, really robust research. It's definitely an original narrative voice. This is a life's work that this woman has put together. I mean, it's absolutely, I can't believe what she's undertaken here. I'm full of awe for what she's achieved. I was going to say attempting to achieve, but I think she's probably achieved it, although I haven't read it yet in its entirety, so I can't comment. And it definitely represents excellence in writing. But I do have a slight issue with accessibility. And there are several reasons for this. I think there's some quite complex economics in here. There is a level of detail that is almost encyclopedic. So in some ways, it doesn't read like a reference book, but it, you know, it to me, this is a textbook that might accompany some part of a degree course or something like that. It's not necessarily the sort of book that I would sit and read down cover to cover. I think it's a shame it's not been produced in several shorter volumes, actually, although maybe the overarching thing wouldn't work. And I can't, you know, I've got to be careful what I say because I haven't read it all yet. But I am really enjoying it, and I am going to read it, particularly because I'm off hopefully next year to India. So I really want to use this as a way of enhancing my understanding. And the section on Gandhi is brilliant. You know, I feel I really understand a lot better. I feel like my view of Gandhi has been a bit biased. Why? Well, it would be, wouldn't it? Because I've seen it from a very Western perspective. And that's one thing that Chatterji is setting out to do. She wants to write the history of this part of the world from the perspective of its inhabitants, because she feels that the history of this of Southeast Asia has been written and narrated so often by white voices, by colonial voices, and she's really trying to redress that balance. So for me, you know, I think it's a superb endeavour, but I do question the accessibility of it. I think it's a really challenging read. There is a lot of information per page, and I'm not, you know, I'm not against that. I'm you know, I have an academic nature, but and I also think just simply the weight of it, it sounds like a really trivial thing to say, but you can't sit and read this in bed very easily. You know, you can't sort of prop yourself up. So again, I'm not trying to put anybody off this, because I think it's wonderful, and you know, I'm really selfishly very pleased that this has appeared, because I think it's going to really enhance my experience of going to India. But I've got a few caveats which I've just explained to you, and really I need to stop now. So if I just quickly grovel down here, sorry, and backtrack, I would say that, and I know I'm summarising here, but I would say that Vulture Capitalism certainly meets all the criteria for the Women's Prize. And I really like her voice. I think her voice comes through. There's passion here. There's, you know, she's I suspect that deep down, Grace is very frustrated and very angry about the way that the world is being run. But there's no bitterness in here. You know, there's no, I don't know, it could be really acerbic, but it's not, or that's the wrong word. It could be really acidic, but it's not. It's very balanced as well. She criticises Democrats and Republicans. She criticises the Labour Party and the Tory Party. You know, she's trying to be as balanced as she possibly can. And you know, I'm fairly confident she's got connections with the Labour Party, so she kind of has to. If she wants her argument to be taken seriously, then she's got to show that she's looking at both points of view, and I think she does that really, really well. So I would argue that she meets all the criteria. I would argue that Codependent does too, with Madhumita Murgia. I think she also fulfills all the criteria. And by the way, if I'm pronouncing names wrong, I really, really apologise. It's just my ignorance, and I really ought to do something about it. I think you could tell from the way that I talked about Young Queens that definitely meets all the criteria. And the Britannias, I'm not sure. I didn't find it accessible. I struggled a little bit with it, and I know it's really well researched, and definitely she has a really distinctive, very spiritual voice. But for me, there was something in terms of just clinging on to the information that didn't quite work. And then I would argue that How to Say Babylon meets all those criteria as well. So there we go. So actually, I'm quite pleased in a way, because I feel that I've done all these books justice, with the possible exception of Shadows at Noon. But that also means that my Women's Prize reading journey can continue. And when I do finish that book, obviously I will report back and compare my views of it at the end to how I feel about it now. So I really hope you've enjoyed following me on this wonderful journey of exploration. I honestly feel that I've really educated myself by reading this long list. I feel as though I've taken a sort of combined honours degree in all these different subjects. And particularly I feel like I'm better informed about, having read Codependent and Vulture Capitalism and Doppelganger, I feel that I'm a lot more au fait with developments in the world of politics and digital media that I otherwise would not have been. So thank you to all you wonderful women out there who've written these amazing books, and all you women out there who are striving to produce equally masterful non-fiction. And a massive thank you to the lovely people at the Women's Prize for sending me all the books so that I could go on this reading journey. And isn't it exciting? I don't know who's going to be on that shortlist. I am actually well, no, I'm not. I'm going to start to think about it and then do it tomorrow, because I need to mull it over. I'm going to pick my own shortlist of 6 books, and I don't know what they're going to be yet. I haven't decided. So I think I need to sleep on it and let my thoughts settle before I put that video together. So wherever you are, happy reading. Take care. Bye.